Hello, Mosaic family and guests tuning in. Welcome. It's always an honor to talk with you and to share God's Word with you. And today, Pastor Brian has asked me to talk with you about what Jesus said about swearing and taking oaths in the Sermon on the Mount. And you can find that in chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. You know, Matthew 5, in what we've come to call the Sermon on the Mount, is Jesus' core teaching on what a human heart that is like God's heart would look like, especially as it relates to other people. And here Jesus says, again, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. You know, this text is not about using bad language. Sometimes we make that leap because when we grow up, kids say, don't swear, or he swore. And what they're talking about is using foul language. But this is really about verbal manipulation. And also about what a much better alternative to verbal manipulation is. In Jesus' day, swearing was a big deal. And who and what you swore by was how you made agreements that were binding. It's how you did law. It's how you made contracts and covenants. And of course, all law gets misused because it's not necessarily about the heart. It can become about power apart from love. And what Jesus is describing here is ways of trying to use heavy words to pressure or convince people into agreeing with you. And we see people doing this all over our world, don't we? From bumper stickers to what gets called news to advertising. And even in basic conversation, people are trying to use heavy language to get you to feel, think, and agree to certain things, and therefore go their way. It's obviously very important not to be false, isn't it? Lying is bad. And what Jesus is getting at is that people will use language in such a way as to convince you that they are not lying and therefore you must do what they want. We will say things in trying to convince others like, I swear to God, or I swear on a Bible, or people may swear on themselves. When Jesus mentions this line about taking an oath by your head, that's an old Near Eastern way of saying something like, if I'm lying, may my head be cut off. Which may sound a little strange to us, but at the same time, you remember when you were a kid and somebody said, cross my heart and hope to die? And that was a way of saying, you better believe me. These are all ways of trying to convince. And after saying these convincing things, then you proclaim whatever it is you want to be sure that others are to agree with you on. People will say things like, I'd stake my career on it, or I'd stake my reputation on it. I walk by a neighbor's car that has a bumper sticker that says, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And that's a way of swearing and using a bit of contempt to get you to move a certain way and agree. Now, Jesus replies to these situations by simply saying, God just won't have any of this. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, stop the song and dance. Give up trying to pull other people's strings. Respect them as persons made in the image of God with a will to do whatever they choose. You know, when you look at a Jesus teaching, one thing you never see him doing is trying to twist anyone's arm. More often, he seems to put really stark contrasts, even troubling contrasts, between the way we usually do things and the way God does things. And then he just has a way of letting those things sit there and trouble us so that we'll go away and we'll work on them. Perhaps he does this because he knows that people have a need to work things out for themselves and arrive at truth through their own thought and experience. It's how any of us really grows, isn't it? Through our own thought and experience. I don't know about you, but in times past when I've realized that someone manipulated me, even if it was towards something good, I haven't loved them for it. Have you? I think I just want to let you think about that for a second. As people have done those kinds of things, manipulated you, even if it was towards something good, did you love them for it? And as you're thinking about that, I want to do something a little different. I want to move us towards how we become the kind of person who can live free of verbal manipulation. You know, if you try really hard to do the things that Jesus teaches, if you try really hard, what will happen is you'll make yourself miserable and you'll make others miserable as well. However, if you put yourself in the right context, you can be changed. And if you want to change, you have to make arrangements so that what lives in you, what lives in any of us, now can get swapped out with something better, a different kind of life. The reason that we do things like use language to try to control others is that we're afraid of not having our way. And that fear and the actions that come with it are automatic. They live in us. And one of the best ways we can change this is to practice the overall way of life that Jesus practiced. And one of the things he did often was to go into solitude. And when we go into solitude, one of the things that we get is silence. Now, why does this matter? It matters because our habits live in our bodies. You remember when you were learning to drive a car for the first time? When you started, you had to learn to drive a car in your mind. But the experience of driving was awkward because your body hadn't learned to drive yet. Now, the opposite is also true. Your body now knows how to drive, that you've done it enough, so much so that it's become completely automatic. You are able to drive long distances, and it's almost scary that you can get there without thinking about it because your body knows how to do it. And that's why the apostles, especially Paul, are so big on changing what is both in your mind and in your body. They understood this well. They were very sophisticated. In Romans 12, 1-2, Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You'll notice both the idea here that we are to do something with our bodies and the idea that we're to do something with our minds. Those two are connected. If you want to change something in your character, it can't just be living in your mind. It has to get all the way to the habits of your body. So to present your body as a living sacrifice, you need to put your body in a context where God can work on you. And one of the most important ways that we can do that is through solitude and silence. Jesus practiced it, and many saints after him have as well, and they testify to its ability to transform us. The great physicist and theologian Pascal said, I have discovered that all of the unhappiness of men arises from one single fact, that they are unable to sit quietly in their rooms alone. It's a bold statement, isn't it? All of the unhappiness of men. Could that be true? So let's talk a minute about what solitude does for you, and I'll let you decide. Have you heard the word triggers? People talk a lot now about their triggers. What triggers their anxiety or their fear or their anger? Sometimes people use other language like buttons. He really pushes my buttons when he does that. We know intuitively that something lives in us that touches off automatic thoughts and feelings, and we just don't have peace when that happens. Paul called this sin dwelling in our members. What he was getting at is what science is catching up to and calling muscle and nerve memory and even cellular memory. There's a certain kind of knowledge that gets into our bodies. Those triggers or buttons that we experience started in our minds, but now they live in our bodies. And the world put them there. Now I want to ask you something. What would it be like if your triggers were simply gone? What solitude does is allows us a way to get away from the world, including its sounds, and therefore experience a length of time where our buttons aren't being pushed. And what can happen is that we can discover that our bad habits and our bad desires and all of this automatic stuff that runs our lives can simply drop away. In other words, it gives us a chance with God's help to remove our triggers. Again, what would that be like? How do you imagine your life? Now, this relates to our passage. The reason we do things like verbally manipulate others is that there are sets of triggers in us, and we are set automatically to manage our world apart from God. Verbal manipulation is something that involves our voice, and therefore it involves our body as well as our mind. The silence we experience in solitude gives us a chance to change, to let our body be reprogrammed, to where we have a different set of triggers, kingdom triggers, that are based on love and respect. And we find that we just don't need to talk so much. We find that we don't need to rush. And we find that we don't need to manipulate. Now, if you want a detailed treatment of silence and solitude, one of the best resources that you can read is Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, and that's in pages 357 through 360. Now, I've also had a number of you ask for personal examples, so I'm just going to share a little bit of my own testimony of how I do this and what the effects are. One of the best things I found that anybody can do is to get away somewhere and have 24 hours of silence and solitude. And I once went away to a cabin, and I did this. I simply enjoyed the sounds of nature, some long walks, and a lot of naps. One of the things we often experience actually in solitude and silence is just how tired we are. Sometimes I have people come to me and they say, when I go in to try to practice solitude, I end up wanting to go to sleep. And I tell them, that's wonderful. Our world is a very noisy, demanding one, and we don't rest enough. But getting away can allow us to do so. And what my experience of being away for 24 hours in silence and solitude did was help me to discover a lot more of who I really am, who God made me to be. And that's because what happened was all of the little anxieties and fears and desires that do me absolutely no good had some time to drop away. And what I began to be aware of is my real soul in God's presence. Remember, Jesus said, the kingdom of the heavens is at hand. That's the good news. And that means it's right here, available to us. But we often have so much noise in our minds and in our bodies that we're just walking through life constantly triggered. And we can't be at peace enough to be aware of ourselves or of God. You know, a few years ago, I confessed to Pastor Brian that I was having a lot of trouble reading my Bible regularly. And this was really bothering me, especially because I would have these times every few weeks or sometimes as long as months where I would just suddenly devour my Bible, and it would really change me. And as I prayed about why there were these long stretches, but then this sudden ability to read, I realized two things. One is that trying harder to read my Bible never worked. However, the times when I did read was when I had had enough solitude and silence to do so. And when I was refreshed and rested enough, and my mind was clear enough to get God's word into me, habits like not using verbal manipulation came easy and naturally. Now, one other word. A retreat like 24 hours in silence at a cabin is good, But that is really just to give us a baseline practice. What I've learned is that I also need about 3 hours a week, every week, where I can get away. And what happens is I find inner quiet when I do that. And when I find inner quiet, I enjoy who I am, and I enjoy who God is again. And I end up wanting to be creative. Those things that I always wish I could do more of but put off, like drawing or listening to music or working with my hands, I actually end up doing those. And what that allows me to do is to learn how to have silence and solitude more and more of all the time in my life. When I'm at work or with my family or with friends, I can still have inner quiet because those old buttons and triggers are more and more progressively going away. So to close, I just want to say this. I've never known anyone who, by trying harder in the moment to do Jesus' teachings, became anything other than a rigid legalist, or they finally gave up and became a cynic. And I'd like to ask you, have you ever known anyone or yourself that just by trying harder, that this really worked? However, I have known those who train in the way that Jesus trained. They've actually shaped their life around the kind of life that he lived and led. And they were actually changed. They were changed so that they had a heart free of the things Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount, like anger, lust, verbal manipulation, and other surprising things. Some of you have been practicing Sabbath and have found that you're being transformed. Just like Sabbath, solitude and silence take arranging our lives in a different way than the world does. But if we will do it, I think the experience will be well worth it. I'm going to leave you with that to consider. So good to be with you, church. Blessings.